10 years is enough. I want a younger man who doesn't count pennies to buy me Prada bags." She forgot that the company paying for her lifestyle was mine. I took the microphone and said something that left her speechless. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Charles, and I'm 60 years old. After 10 years of marriage, I thought I knew my wife Michelle completely. I was wrong about everything. The corporate anniversary party was supposed to be a celebration. 200 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Marriott downtown, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in white linen. I had spent months planning this event for my company's 15-year milestone. The champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the room, and everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. I stood near the bar, watching Michelle work the crowd in her red designer dress. She moved with confidence, her blonde hair perfectly styled, diamond earrings catching the light every time she turned her head. At 45, she was still stunning, and I felt proud to call her my wife. She had this way of making everyone feel important when she spoke to them, her hand gently touching their arm as she laughed at their jokes. "Charles, wonderful party," said Robert, one of my biggest clients, shaking my hand firmly. "Michelle looks absolutely radiant tonight." I smiled, sipping my scotch. "She does, doesn't she? I'm a lucky man." But as the evening progressed, I noticed something different about Michelle. She kept glancing at her phone, her smile becoming more forced with each passing hour. During dinner, she barely touched her food, pushing the salmon around her plate while staring off into the distance. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked, leaning closer to her. She turned to me with that practiced smile I had seen 1,000 times. "Of course, darling. Just tired from all the preparation." The MC announced it was time for speeches, and several of my business partners took turns at the microphone, sharing stories about our company's growth and success. The crowd applauded politely after each speech, the atmosphere warm and celebratory. Then, Michelle stood up. My heart skipped a beat. She hadn't mentioned wanting to speak tonight. I watched as she made her way to the microphone, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone stand, her hands trembling slightly. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "I hope you're all having a wonderful time tonight." The crowd murmured appreciatively. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, though I couldn't explain why. Michelle paused, looking directly at me across the room. Her expression was cold, calculated, nothing like the warm woman I had fallen in love with a decade ago. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about life, about what we want versus what we settle for," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "about the difference between surviving and truly living." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel people glancing between Michelle and me, sensing something was terribly wrong. "Charles has been a good provider," she said, gesturing in my direction, "but after 10 years of marriage, I've realized something important. 10 years is enough." My blood ran cold. The room was dead silent now, forks suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses frozen in mid-air. "I want more than just security," Michelle continued, her voice gaining momentum. "I want passion, I want excitement, I want a younger man who doesn't count pennies when I ask for a Prada bag or hesitate before booking a trip to Paris." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I felt my face burning with humiliation as 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my wedding ring suddenly feeling unbearably tight. "So tonight, in front of all of you, I'm announcing that I want a divorce," Michelle declared, her chin lifted defiantly. "I deserve someone who can give me the life I truly want, not someone who makes me feel guilty for wanting beautiful things." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel the weight of every stare in the room. My business partners looked horrified. My employees sat frozen in shock. This was supposed to be a celebration of everything I had built, and my own wife had just destroyed it all. But then something clicked inside me. A calm, cold clarity washed over me as I realized what I had to do. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket as I walked toward the microphone. Michelle stepped aside, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She thought she had won, thought she had humiliated me completely. She had no idea what was coming. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd of faces staring back at me. These were my employees, my clients, my friends. They had just witnessed my wife publicly destroy our marriage, and they were waiting to see how I would respond. "Thank you, Michelle," I said calmly into the microphone, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. That was quite a speech. I turned slightly to look at her, noting how her confident expression had shifted to something more uncertain. "You mentioned wanting a man who can afford Prada bags without counting pennies," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Someone who won't hesitate to book trips to Paris. Someone who can give you the life you truly want." Michelle nodded, her chin still raised in defiance. I smiled then, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he held all the cards in a game his opponent didn't even know they were playing. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the room, "my wife has just asked for a divorce from the man who owns this company, the man whose name is on every paycheck in this room, the man who has been funding her lifestyle for the past 10 years. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible this time. Michelle's face went pale, her confident posture wavering. "Every Prada bag, every trip to Paris, every designer dress, including the one she's wearing tonight, has been paid for by the company she just insulted," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "The same company that employs half the people in this room and provides services to the other half." Michelle's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. "So yes, Michelle, you can have your divorce," I concluded, setting the microphone back in its stand. "And you can also find out exactly how much younger men are willing to spend on Prada bags when they discover you don't have access to mine anymore." The room erupted in shocked whispers as I walked back to my table, leaving Michelle standing alone at the microphone, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. But this was only the beginning. As I sat down and reached for my scotch, I realized that Michelle had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had forgotten who she was dealing with. The ride home from the party was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Michelle sat in the passenger seat of our Mercedes, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring out the window as city lights blurred past. The silence between us was thick with tension, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. I could feel her anger radiating from across the leather seats, but I remained calm. After what she had just done, after the humiliation she had put me through in front of everyone I knew professionally, she had the audacity to be upset with me. When we pulled into our driveway, Michelle finally spoke. "How could you embarrass me like that?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "In front of all those people?" I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. "I embarrassed you?" I asked quietly, turning to look at her. "Michelle, you just asked for a divorce in front of 200 people at my company's anniversary party." She rolled her eyes, that gesture I had grown to hate over the past few months. "Oh, please, Charles, don't act like you didn't see this coming. You're not stupid." Maybe not, but I had been willfully blind. As we walked into our house, the same house I had bought and furnished and maintained for the past 8 years, I realized it was time to stop pretending. "You're right," I said, loosening my tie as we entered the foyer. "I'm not stupid, which is why I know about Marcus." Michelle froze halfway up the stairs, her hand gripping the banister. She turned slowly to face me, her face carefully composed, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked to my study and pulled out a manila folder from my desk drawer. I had been dreading this moment for months, but now it felt liberating. "Marcus Patterson, 28 years old, personal trainer at Elite Fitness," I said, reading from the papers in the folder. "You've been meeting him every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 months, but not for workouts." Michelle's face went white. She came down the stairs slowly, her designer heels clicking against the marble steps. "And then there's David," I continued, flipping to another page. "David Chen, 32, investment banker. You've been having lunch with him every Friday at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, except you're not eating lunch, are you, Michelle?" She reached the bottom of the stairs, her breathing shallow. "Charles, I can explain—" "Can you explain this?" I interrupted, pulling out my phone and pressing play on an audio recording. Michelle's voice filled the room, crystal clear through the phone's speaker. "He's such a pathetic old man, David. Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can pretend to find him attractive. But his money makes up for a lot, doesn't it?" David's laughter came through the recording. "You're terrible, Michelle. But hey, at least you're getting something out of it. Just think about that new jewelry collection you were showing me." "Oh, that was just the beginning," Michelle's recorded voice continued. "You should see the credit limits he gave me. The man is completely clueless. I could probably buy a car and he'd just assume it was for groceries." I stopped the recording and looked at Michelle, whose face was now completely drained of color. "There are hours of these conversations," I said quietly. "Hours of you laughing about how stupid and gullible I am. Hours of you planning what you were going to spend my money on next." Michelle sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her perfect composure finally cracking. "Charles, please let me explain." "Explain what?" I asked, my voice remaining calm despite the rage building inside me. "Explain how you've been cheating on me for months. Explain how you've been using my money to fund your affairs. Or explain how you've been laughing at me behind my back while I work 16-hour days to pay for your lifestyle." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, but they didn't move me anymore. I had seen too much, heard too much. "You want to know the really fascinating part?" I continued, walking closer to where she sat. "I started investigating when I noticed charges on our credit card for hotels I had never been to. $200 here, $300 there. At first, I thought maybe someone had stolen your card." Michelle wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her perfect makeup. "But then I realized the pattern," I said, opening the folder again. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, hotel charges at the same time your phone showed you were at the gym. Every Friday, restaurant charges during your shopping trips. You got sloppy, Michelle." "How long have you known?" she whispered. 3 months, I replied. 3 months of watching you lie to my face every single day. 3 months of listening to you complain about how I don't give you enough money, enough attention, enough excitement, while you were busy giving both to other men." She stood up suddenly, anger flashing in her eyes. "You had me followed? You recorded my private conversations?" I almost laughed at her indignation. "Your private conversations about spending my money on your affairs? Yes, I did. And you know what the best part was? Learning that you've been planning this divorce for months, planning to take me for everything I'm worth while you start fresh with someone younger." Michelle's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to argue, but no words came out. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" I asked, stepping closer to her. "Did you think you could humiliate me publicly and then walk away with half of everything I've built?" "It's my right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm your wife. I deserve—" "You deserve exactly what you've contributed to this marriage," I interrupted, "which, as we both know, is absolutely nothing." The truth hung in the air between us like a physical presence. For 10 years, Michelle had contributed nothing to our household income, nothing to our mortgage payments, nothing to our investments or savings. She had been a beautiful, expensive decoration in my life, and I had been too infatuated to see it clearly. "I want you out of this house by tomorrow," I said, my voice steady and final. "You can't throw me out," Michelle protested. "This is my home, too." I pulled out another document from the folder, this one bearing official letterhead. "Actually, I can. This house is in my name only, purchased before we were married. According to the prenuptial agreement you signed, you have no claim to it." Michelle stared at the document, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, fear. "Prenup," she whispered. "We didn't sign a prenup." I smiled that cold smile again. "Check page 15 of the marriage license paperwork you signed. It's all there, witnessed and notarized. You were so excited about the wedding, so focused on the dress and the flowers and the guest list, you never bothered to read what you were signing. The color drained from her face completely as the realization hit her. She had been so eager to become Mrs. Charles Morrison, so focused on the lifestyle that came with my name, that she had signed away her right to claim any of it. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice was shaky now, uncertain. "Actually, it is," I replied, closing the folder. "Your credit cards will be canceled in the morning. Your access to our joint accounts has already been revoked. And Michelle?" She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "The recording I played for you tonight? That was just a sample. I have enough evidence to destroy you in divorce court if you try to fight this." As I watched my wife of 10 years realize that her comfortable life was about to disappear overnight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete control. For the first time since I had discovered her betrayal, I was the one holding all the cards. But this was still just the beginning of what Michelle was about to lose. The next morning, I woke up alone for the first time in 10 years. Michelle had packed 3 suitcases during the night and left without saying goodbye. I found a note on the kitchen counter written on her personalized stationery. "This isn't over, Charles. My lawyer will be in touch." I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then made myself coffee in the silence of my own home. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. The pretending was over, the lying was done, and now I could focus on what really mattered. My phone rang at exactly 8 in the morning. It was Sarah, my executive assistant of 12 years. "Mr. Morrison, I've been fielding calls all morning about last night," she said, her voice carefully professional. "Several clients want to schedule meetings, and there are 3 reporters asking for statements." "No interviews," I said, sipping my coffee. "Schedule the client meetings for next week, and Sarah, start preparing the Henderson files." There was a pause. Sarah knew exactly what the Henderson files contained, and why I might need them now. "Are you sure, sir?" she asked quietly. "Very sure. It's time." After hanging up, I drove to my office building downtown. Morrison Consulting occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, housing 42 employees and generating approximately $2 million in annual revenue. It was a successful business by any measure, and Michelle had always assumed it was the source of all our wealth. She had never been more wrong about anything in her life. I took the private elevator to my office on the 20th floor, nodding to the security guard who had been with the building for 15 years. As I settled behind my desk, I opened the wall safe, hidden behind a painting of the Rocky Mountains. Inside were documents that Michelle had never seen, investments she had never heard of, and bank statements from accounts she didn't even know existed. The truth was, Morrison Consulting was my hobby. My real wealth came from Henderson Holdings, a private investment company I had inherited from my father when I was 35. For 25 years, I had quietly grown that inheritance into something extraordinary, while letting everyone believe that my consulting business was my primary source of income. My father had taught me the value of discretion when it came to money. "Never let them see your real hand, son," he had told me before. He died. The moment people know what you're truly worth, they start looking at you differently. They want pieces of what you've built instead of building something themselves. I had taken his advice to heart. When I met Michelle 15 years ago at a charity dinner, I had presented myself as a successful small business owner, comfortable but not wealthy, well off but not rich. She had seemed charmed by my modest lifestyle, my practical approach to money, my reluctance to spend on extravagant things. What I hadn't realized then was that she was already calculating how much she could extract from me. I pulled out the Henderson Holdings portfolio and spread the documents across my desk. Real estate investments in 12 states worth approximately $47 million. Stock portfolios managed by 3 different firms, totaling $32 million. Private equity investments in emerging technologies, valued at $23 million. And that didn't include the rental properties, the municipal bonds, or the offshore accounts my father had established decades ago. In total, my net worth was approximately $115 million, Michelle had been spending money that represented less than 2% of my actual wealth, and she had still managed to betray me for more. The irony was bitter. If she had simply been faithful, if she had loved me for who I was instead of what she thought she could get from me, I would have eventually shared everything with her. I had been planning to reveal the truth about my wealth on our 10th anniversary next month. I had even had plans drawn up to build her the dream house she had been talking about for years. Instead, she had shown me exactly who she really was. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Charles, this is ridiculous. I'm staying at the Hilton downtown and my credit card was declined. Fix this immediately. Michelle." I deleted the message without responding. 5 minutes later, another text. "I know you're angry, but this is childish. I need access to money for basic necessities." I blocked the number. At 10:30, my desk phone rang. Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, there's a Michelle Morrison here to see you. She says she's your wife." "Send her up," I said. It was time for Michelle to learn the truth. She walked into my office, wearing the same red dress from last night, her hair disheveled and her makeup smudged. She had clearly slept in her clothes, and the confident woman who had humiliated me 12 hours ago was nowhere to be seen. "Charles, thank God," she said, rushing toward my desk. "There's been some kind of mistake with our accounts. My cards aren't working, and the hotel is demanding payment for last night." I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. "There's no mistake, Michelle. I told you last night that your access to our accounts was revoked." "But that's insane," she protested, her voice rising. "I need money. I can't just live on the street." "You should have thought about that before you decided to publicly destroy our marriage," I replied calmly. She began pacing in front of my desk, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Look, I know I handled things poorly last night, but this is extreme. We can work something out. We can go to counseling. We can—" "Michelle," I interrupted, "sit down." Something in my tone made her stop pacing. She looked at me carefully, then slowly took the chair across from my desk. "Do you want to know something interesting?" I asked, pulling out one of the Henderson Holdings statements. "You've been married to me for 10 years, and you've never once asked me about my family background." She frowned, clearly confused by the change in topic. "What does that have to do with anything?" "My father died 25 years ago," I continued, ignoring her question. "He left me something that I've never told you about. Something I've been managing quietly while you've been busy spending what you thought was all my money." I slid the bank statement across the desk toward her. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and I watched her face change as she processed what she was seeing. "This account balance," she whispered. "This can't be right." "Henderson Holdings," I said. "My father's investment company, which I've been running since his death. That statement shows the balance from just one of 7 accounts." Michelle's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. $38 million, she read aloud, her voice barely audible. "That's just liquid assets," I said, pulling out more documents. "There are also real estate holdings, stock portfolios, private investments, and trust funds that won't mature for another decade." I watched as the full scope of what she was learning hit her. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, realization, and finally devastation. "You mean all this time," she said slowly. "When I was asking you to spend more money, when I was complaining about your budget consciousness, you actually had—" "More money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes?" I finished. "Yes." She stared at the documents spread across my desk, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "But why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think we were just comfortable?" I leaned forward, my voice cold. "Because I wanted to know who you really were, Michelle. I wanted to know if you loved me for me, or if you loved me for what I could give you." The silence stretched between us as she processed this information. Finally, she looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Charles, if I had known, everything would have been different. I would never have—" "You would never have what?" I asked. "Cheated on me, used me, humiliated me in public, or you just would have been more careful not to get caught?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. We both knew the answer. "Here's the thing, Michelle," I said, gathering the documents back into a neat pile. "You just divorced one of the wealthiest men in the state because you thought he wasn't wealthy enough for you." The irony of it hit her like a physical blow. I could see the moment she realized what she had lost, what she had thrown away for the attention of men who wouldn't be able to afford her morning coffee. "Charles, please," she whispered. "We can fix this. We can start over. I made a mistake, but—" "No," I said firmly. "You made a choice. You chose to betray our marriage for men who have nothing compared to what you already had access to. You chose to humiliate me in front of everyone I work with, and most importantly, you chose to do all of this while spending money that you now know represented pocket change in my real financial picture." I stood up and walked around my desk to where she sat, frozen in shock. "The prenup you signed covers all my assets, Michelle, all of them, including the ones you didn't know about." She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Get out of my office," I said quietly, "and don't come back." As I watched my ex-wife walk out of my office for the last time, clutching the bank statement that showed her just how much she had lost, I felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in 10 years, I was free to be exactly who I really was. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Michelle's world unravel from the comfortable distance of my office. My private investigator, a former police detective named Robert Kane, provided daily updates on her increasingly desperate situation. "She's been calling everyone in your social circle," Robert reported during our Tuesday morning meeting. "The Hendersons, the Williamses, even tried reaching out to your old college friends. She's looking for someone to take her in." I wasn't surprised. Michelle had spent 10 years cultivating relationships with people based entirely on the assumption that she was married to a modestly wealthy man. Now that word was spreading about our divorce, and more importantly, about how she had initiated it. Those same people were distancing themselves. "What about her boyfriends?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Robert smiled grimly. "Marcus, the personal trainer, stopped returning her calls the day after your anniversary party. David, the investment banker, was more direct. He told her he wasn't interested in dating unemployed women." The bitter irony of it was almost amusing. Michelle had betrayed our marriage for men who disappeared the moment her financial situation became uncertain. She had traded a lifetime of security for a few months of excitement with men who wouldn't even pay for her hotel room. But I wasn't finished yet. The first phase of my plan had been to cut off her access to money immediately. That had been accomplished the Riga night of the party when I froze our joint accounts and canceled her credit cards. The second phase was more subtle but far more devastating. I picked up my phone and called James Whitfield, my accountant for the past 15 years. "James, it's time to implement the Morrison Trust restructuring we discussed," I said when he answered. "Are you certain about this, Charles?" James asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I'm certain." What Michelle didn't know was that even Morrison Consulting, the business she thought represented my entire wealth, wasn't actually owned by me personally. Everything was structured through a complex series of trusts and holding companies that my father had established decades ago. This structure protected assets from lawsuits, divorce proceedings, and creditors, but it also meant that I could transfer ownership of everything away from myself, if necessary. Within 3 days, Charles Morrison, the individual, owned almost nothing. Charles Morrison, the beneficiary of the Morrison Family Trust, however, controlled everything. Michelle's lawyers would spend months trying to find assets to claim, only to discover that there was nothing in my personal name to take. The third phase of my plan was the most satisfying. I had always been a private person, but Michelle's public humiliation of me had made discretion impossible. If she wanted to make our personal business public, then the public deserved to know the whole truth. I called Patricia Chen, a journalist I had known since college who now wrote for the city's largest newspaper. Patricia specialized in business profiles and had been asking to interview me for years about my company's success. "Patricia, it's Charles Morrison," I said when she answered. "I think I'm ready for that interview now." "Really? What changed your mind?" "Let's just say I've learned the value of being completely transparent about who I am and what I've built." We scheduled the interview for the following week, and I spent the weekend preparing. For the first time in 25 years, I was going to tell the complete truth about my wealth, my investments, and the empire I had inherited and grown in silence. Meanwhile, Michelle's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Robert reported that she had been forced to move from the expensive downtown hotel to a budget motel on the outskirts of the city. Her attempts to find employment were unsuccessful, largely because she had no work experience and no marketable skills. She applied for a receptionist position at a dental office, Robert told me during our Friday update. They offered her $12 an hour. She walked out during the interview. $12 an hour. For a woman who had been spending $3,000 a month on clothing and beauty treatments, the reality of actual work was apparently unthinkable. But the most telling update came on Thursday afternoon. "She's been calling Marcus and David repeatedly," Robert said. "Marcus finally answered yesterday and told her to stop contacting him or he'd file a restraining order. David has blocked her number entirely." I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair. "What about her family?" "Her sister in Phoenix said she could visit for a week but couldn't offer permanent housing. Her parents live in that retirement community in Florida, and apparently her mother told her they don't have space for long-term guests." Michelle was learning what I had always known but had been too generous to acknowledge. She had no real relationships, no genuine connections, no one who valued her for anything other than what she could provide or what status she represented. Her entire social circle had been built around her position as my wife, and without that position, she was nothing to them. On Wednesday, exactly 2 weeks after our divorce was finalized, Michelle showed up at my office building again. Security called up to inform me she was in the lobby, demanding to see me. "Send her up," I said. I was curious to see how far she had fallen. When Michelle walked into my office, I barely recognized her. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the designer clothing, the confident posture that had defined her for as long as I had known her. Instead, she wore jeans and a wrinkled sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face bare of makeup and showing every one of her 45 years. "Charles," she said, her voice hoarse, "we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, not offering her a chair. "About us, about this mistake I made." She moved closer to my desk, her hands clasped together as if she were praying. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we loved each other once. We can find our way back to that." I studied her carefully. The desperation in her voice was new, but it wasn't genuine remorse. It was fear, fear of a life without the safety net she had taken for granted. "Did we love each other?" I asked quietly. "Or did you love my money while I loved an illusion?" "That's not fair," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I handled things terribly, but underneath all of that, there was something real between us." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, different from the one containing her affair evidence. This one contained something much more damaging. "I had Robert do some additional investigating after you moved out," I said, opening the folder. "Do you want to know what he found?" Michelle's face paled, but she didn't respond. "He found the emails you sent to your sister 3 years ago," I continued, reading from the printout. "The ones where you described me as boring but loaded, and talked about how you were playing the long game until you could figure out how to maximize your divorce settlement." Michelle's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "He also found the conversations you had with your friend, Jennifer, about finding a divorce attorney who specialized in bleeding rich husbands dry." That was 6 months ago, Michelle. 6 months before you started your affairs. I set the papers down and looked at her directly. "You didn't make a mistake. You executed a plan. The only mistake was getting caught before you could finish what you started." She slumped into the chair across from my desk. her composure finally breaking completely. "Charles, please. I have nothing. Nowhere to go, no money, no job prospects. I'm 45 years old and I've never worked a real job in my life." "That's not my problem anymore," I said simply. "You can't just leave me with nothing," she said, her desperation turning to anger. "I was your wife for 10 years. I contributed to your life, to your success." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What exactly did you contribute, Michelle? You didn't work, you didn't clean, you didn't cook, you didn't manage our finances or social calendar or anything else that might be considered a contribution to our marriage. You spent money and looked beautiful at parties. That was the extent of your contribution." The truth of it hung in the air between us. Michelle had been what my grandfather would have called a decoration, beautiful to look at, expensive to maintain, but ultimately serving no practical purpose. "I'm not going to let you destroy me," she said, her voice rising. "I'll fight you in court. I'll tell everyone about how you hid your money, how you lied to me about what you were worth." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Tell everyone how you divorced a man worth over $100 million because you didn't think he spent enough money on you. Tell everyone how you cheated on him with unemployed men because you wanted more excitement. Tell everyone how you planned to take him for everything he was worth while mocking him behind his back." Michelle's face crumpled as she realized her threats were empty. Any attempt to destroy my reputation would only make her look worse. "The interview comes out Sunday," I added. "Patricia Chen from the Herald. A complete profile of my business empire, including the assets you never knew about. By Monday morning, everyone in the city will know exactly what you walked away from." I stood up and moved to the door, opening it for her. "Goodbye, Michelle. Don't come back." As I watched her walk toward the elevator, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. The woman who had manipulated and used me, who had planned to destroy me financially while mocking me emotionally, was finally facing the consequences of her own choices. But more importantly, I was finally free to live the life I actually wanted, surrounded by people who valued me for who I truly was, rather than what they thought they could get from me. The newspaper interview was published on Sunday morning, and by noon my phone was ringing non-stop. Patricia Chen had done exactly what I had hoped she would do. She had told the complete truth about my financial empire while subtly revealing the circumstances of my recent divorce. The headline read, "The Silent Billionaire: How Charles Morrison Built a Fortune While Flying Under the Radar." The article detailed my inheritance from my father, the growth of Henderson Holdings, and my decision to live modestly while quietly accumulating wealth. Most damaging to Michelle's reputation, however, was Patricia's description of how my marriage had ended. Morrison's recent divorce came after his wife publicly announced at a company party that she wanted to leave him for someone who could afford a more luxurious lifestyle, Patricia had written. What she apparently didn't know was that her husband's actual net worth exceeded $100 million, making her declaration one of the most expensive mistakes in recent history. I was reading the article for the third time when Robert Kane called with an update that both amused and disgusted me. "She's been calling the newspaper all morning," he reported, demanding they print a retraction, claiming the article is full of lies. Patricia Chen told her that everything was verified through public records and interviews with financial institutions. "What about her living situation?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "She was evicted from the budget motel yesterday for non-payment. She's been staying in her car in a Walmart parking lot." Michelle Morrison, who 6 months ago had been complaining that I wasn't buying her expensive enough jewelry, was now homeless. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. But the real earthquake came on Monday morning. I arrived at my office to find Sarah waiting with a stack of messages and a concerned expression. "Mr. Morrison, we've received calls from 17 different attorneys since the article was published," she said, setting the messages on my desk. "They're all representing women who want to speak with you about their own divorce situations." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of calls?" "Women whose husbands left them after 20 or 30 years of marriage," Sarah explained. "They read about your situation and want legal advice about hidden assets. Apparently, your story has inspired quite a few wives to start investigating their own husbands' finances. The unintended consequence of my public revelation was that other women were now questioning whether their own spouses had been hiding wealth from them. My revenge against Michelle had accidentally started a minor revolution among suspicious wives across the city. But the more significant development came at 10:30, when Sarah announced that Marcus Patterson was in the lobby asking to see me. Michelle's former lover, the personal trainer who had disappeared the moment her money was cut off, apparently wanted to have a conversation. "Send him up," I said, was curious about what the young man could possibly want to discuss. Marcus was everything I had expected. Tall, muscular, artificially tanned, and wearing clothes that cost more than most people made in a week. He walked into my office with the kind of confidence that comes from a life of easy victories and minimal consequences. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for seeing me." I didn't shake his hand. "What do you want, Marcus?" He shifted uncomfortably, apparently not used to such direct treatment. "I wanted to apologize for my involvement with your wife. I had no idea she was married when we first met." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "That's interesting, because my investigator has recordings of conversations where she specifically mentioned being married. She told you I was a tight-fisted small business owner who never bought her nice things." Marcus's confident facade cracked slightly. "Look, Mr. Morrison, I'm not proud of what happened. But Michelle told me you two were practically separated, that the marriage was over in everything but name." "And you believed that?" I asked, "or did you just not care because you thought you were getting access to easy money through her?" The truth was written all over his face. Marcus hadn't seduced Michelle. Michelle had seduced him with promises of what my money could buy. He had been just as much a user as she was, just less successful at it. "Here's what I think happened," I said, standing up and walking around my desk. "I think Michelle convinced you that I was moderately wealthy and completely oblivious. I think she promised you that once she divorced me, she'd have enough money to support both of you in the lifestyle you wanted." Marcus said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "I think you encouraged her affair because you thought it would lead to a profitable divorce settlement that you could share," I continued. "What you didn't realize was that you were helping her destroy the only source of real wealth either of you would ever have access to." I walked back to my desk and opened the folder containing the financial statements I had shown Michelle. "Do you know what she could have had if she had simply been faithful?" I asked, showing him the Henderson Holdings portfolio. "Do you know how much money she threw away for a few months of excitement with you?" Marcus stared at the numbers, his face going pale. That's really what you're worth?" "That's a fraction of what I'm worth," I replied, closing the folder. "And Michelle gave up all of it because she thought you and David Chen represented a better investment than her marriage." I could see the moment it hit him. Marcus realized that he had participated in destroying the very thing he had been hoping to benefit from. His greed and Michelle's stupidity had combined to eliminate the wealth they had both been planning to exploit. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice now shaky, "is there any way? Could you talk to her about working things out?" I almost laughed. "You want me to take back the woman who cheated on me with you so that you can continue having access to her money?" "It's not like that," he protested, but we both knew it was exactly like that. "Get out of my office," I said quietly, "and don't come back." After Marcus left, I called Robert for another update on Michelle's situation. "It's gotten worse," he reported. "She tried to get a job at 3 different restaurants this week. She was fired from the first one after 2 hours for arguing with customers about their orders. The second one wouldn't hire her after she asked if they offered health insurance and paid vacation time on the first day. The third one hired her but fired her the next morning when she didn't show up for her shift." Michelle had never worked a service job in her life, and at 45, she was discovering that the working world had no patience for someone with her attitude and complete lack of practical skills. "She's also been trying to reconnect with her old social circle," Robert continued. The women she used to have lunch with, the couples you two socialized with, none of them will take her calls. I wasn't surprised. Michelle had spent years cultivating relationships based entirely on her status as my wife. She had gossiped about these same people, complained about their houses and cars and vacations, always positioning herself as superior because she was married to someone more successful. Now that her position had crumbled, those people had no reason to associate with her. "Where is she staying now?" I asked. "Her car broke down on Wednesday. She's been sleeping at a homeless shelter downtown." Michelle Morrison, who had once spent $2,000 on a single handbag without thinking twice, was now sleeping in a homeless shelter. The woman who had humiliated me for not being wealthy enough was discovering what actual poverty looked like. But the final blow came on Friday afternoon. David Chen, the investment banker who had been Michelle's other affair partner, called my office. Sarah announced that he wanted to schedule a business meeting to discuss investment opportunities. "Send him up," I said. I was beginning to see a pattern in these visits from Michelle's former lovers. David was everything Marcus wasn't: sophisticated, well-dressed, articulate. He walked into my office with the polished confidence of a man who made his living managing other people's money. "Mr. Morrison," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "thank you for seeing me. I know this is an unusual situation." "That's one way to put it," I replied, gesturing for him to sit down. "I want to be completely transparent about why I'm here," David said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I made a serious error in judgment regarding your wife, and I want to make amends." I raised an eyebrow. "Amends?" "I've read the newspaper article about your financial portfolio," he said. "I'm impressed by the diversification and the growth you've achieved. I'd like to discuss the possibility of Henderson Holdings working with my firm." I stared at him for a long moment. "You want to manage my money?" "I believe my firm could help you optimize your returns," David said smoothly. "We specialize in high-net-worth clients, and based on what I've learned about your holdings, I think we could add significant value." The audacity was breathtaking. David Chen was sitting in my office, asking to manage the very money he had been hoping to access through his affair with my wife. When that plan had failed, he had simply decided to approach me directly. "Tell me, David," I said, leaning back in my chair. "When you were having your lunches with Michelle at the Ritz-Carlton, did you ever discuss my investment portfolio?" David's polished demeanor slipped slightly. "Michelle mentioned that you were conservative with your spending, but—" "Did she show you financial statements?" I interrupted. "Did you help her calculate what she might be able to claim in a divorce?" The silence stretched between us. David's inability to answer was answer enough. "Here's what I think happened," I said, my voice cold. "I think Michelle recruited you specifically because you're an investment banker. I think she showed you what she thought were my complete financial statements, and you helped her plan the optimal strategy for maximizing her divorce settlement." David's face was flushed now, his professional composure cracking under the weight of the truth. "When the affair became profitable enough, she planned to leave me and split the settlement with you," I continued. "The only problem was that the financial statements she showed you represented about 2% of my actual wealth." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the folder containing the recorded conversations between Michelle and David. I had been saving this evidence for exactly this moment. "I have 12 hours of recordings where you two discuss the best way to extract money from me," I said, setting the folder on my desk, "including conversations where you advised her to wait until after our 10-year anniversary to file for divorce because it would maximize her alimony claim." David was visibly sweating now. "Mr. Morrison, I can explain." "No explanation necessary," I said, standing up. "You've confirmed everything I needed to know. You and Michelle weren't having an affair because you found each other irresistible. You were business partners planning to defraud me." I walked to my office door and opened it. "Get out. And if you ever contact me or my companies again, I'll make sure every financial institution in the city knows exactly what kind of business practices you engage in." As I watched David Chen hurry toward the elevator, I realized that Michelle's plan had been even more calculated and cruel than I had originally understood. She hadn't just been cheating on me. She had been building a team of conspirators to help her destroy me financially. But their plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making them wealthy, Michelle's greed had left her homeless and friendless, while her co-conspirators were reduced to begging me for the very opportunities they had tried to steal. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I felt genuinely at peace. Justice wasn't something I had sought. It was something that had emerged naturally from their own choices and consequences. 6 months after Michelle's public humiliation at our anniversary party, I stood on the deck of my mountain cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Colorado Rockies in shades of gold and pink. The property was one of my father's investments that Michelle had never known about. 300 acres of pristine wilderness, with a hand-built log home that had been my refuge during the darkest days of my marriage's collapse. For the first time in 10 years, I was completely alone by choice, rather than by abandonment, and the silence was beautiful. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Kane. Final report attached, case officially closed. I opened the attachment and read through the last chapter of Michelle's story with a mixture of sadness and relief. After 3 months of homelessness, Michelle had finally accepted a job as a night shift clerk at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town. She was earning $9.50 per hour, working 6 nights a week, and living in a studio apartment above a laundromat. Her total monthly income was approximately $1,040, less than she used to spend on a single lunch at her favorite restaurant. Marcus Patterson had moved back in with his parents after losing his apartment when his personal training clients discovered his involvement in my divorce scandal. David Chen had been quietly forced to resign from his investment firm when word spread about his unprofessional conduct. Michelle's affair hadn't just destroyed our marriage, it had created a domino effect that ruined everyone involved. The irony was perfect. Michelle had betrayed our marriage because she wanted more money, more excitement, more luxury. Instead, she had lost access to wealth beyond her wildest dreams and gained a life of genuine struggle for the first time in her adult life. But this story wasn't really about Michelle anymore. It was about what I had discovered about myself in the aftermath of her betrayal. For 35 years, I had followed my father's advice about hiding my wealth, about being cautious with trust, about keeping my true resources secret from everyone around me. I had thought this approach protected me, but Michelle's deception had shown me the flaw in my reasoning. Hiding my wealth hadn't protected me from someone who loved money more than she loved me. It had simply given her a false reason to believe I wasn't worthy of her loyalty. The newspaper interview had changed everything. Within 2 weeks of Patricia Chen's article, I had received dozens of invitations to charity boards, investment partnerships, and social events that had never been available to the modest businessman I had pretended to be. More importantly, I had connected with people who approached me with genuine respect rather than calculated interest. Among those people was Dr. Elizabeth Hartford, a 72-year-old retired surgeon who had called me 3 weeks after the interview was published. She wasn't looking for money or favors. She was offering to show me her own investment portfolio and share strategies she had developed over 4 decades of building wealth in the medical field. "Charles," she had said during our first lunch meeting, "the mistake most wealthy people make is thinking that money makes them special. Money is just a tool. What makes you special is what you choose to do with it." Elizabeth had become my mentor in ways my father never could have been. Where my father had taught me to hide and hoard, Elizabeth taught me to be strategic and purposeful. She introduced me to a community of genuinely wealthy individuals who used their resources to create positive change rather than simply accumulate more possessions. Through Elizabeth, I met Thomas and Margaret Sinclair, a couple in their 80s who had donated over $50 million to educational causes while living in the same modest home they had bought 40 years earlier. I met Dr. James Chen, no relation to David, who had used his pharmaceutical fortune to fund free clinics in underserved communities. I met Sarah Williams, a tech entrepreneur who had revolutionized online learning platforms and was now teaching financial literacy to young women starting their own businesses. These people had something Michelle and her conspirators never possessed: character. They had built their wealth through talent, hard work, and ethical choices, and they used it to improve the world rather than simply to impress others. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of a community that valued substance over appearance, contribution over consumption, integrity over manipulation. The transformation wasn't just social, it was personal. Without Michelle's constant pressure to maintain appearances, to spend money on status symbols that meant nothing to me, I discovered interests and passions I had forgotten I possessed. I began painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I started hiking the mountain trails around my cabin, rediscovering the physical challenges that had once brought me joy. I read books for pleasure rather than just business, traveled to places I wanted to see, rather than places Michelle thought would impress her friends. Most surprisingly, I found myself genuinely interested in philanthropy for the first time. Not the performative charity work that Michelle had insisted. We participate in for social reasons, but real, meaningful contributions to causes that mattered to me. Through Elizabeth's guidance, I established the Morrison Education Foundation, focused on providing scholarships to first-generation college students from low-income families. I funded 3 new computer labs at the community college, where my father had taken night classes before starting his business. I quietly paid off the medical debt for 12 families who had been bankrupted by healthcare costs. None of these donations were publicized or acknowledged. I made them because they felt right, because they honored my father's memory in ways that simply accumulating more wealth never could. But the most meaningful change was in my personal relationships. Free from the performance and pretense that had defined my marriage, I was able to form genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests. 6 months after the divorce, I met Anna Prescott at a charity auction for the local children's hospital. She was a 62-year-old widow who had spent her career as a high school English teacher and was now volunteering with literacy programs for adult learners. We started talking about books and discovered we both loved historical fiction and biographies. Anna knew exactly who I was. The newspaper interview had made my financial situation public knowledge, but she treated me exactly the same way she treated everyone else. When I offered to donate money to her literacy program, she insisted on showing me detailed budgets and impact reports. When I suggested an expensive restaurant for our second dinner, she recommended a small Italian place run by one of her former students. "Charles," she said one evening as we walked through the park near her apartment, "you're a good man who happened to marry a bad woman. Don't let her choices define how you see yourself or how you trust others." Anna was right. Michelle's betrayal had been about Michelle's character, not about mine. Her inability to value what we had together was her failing, not evidence that I was unworthy of genuine love. As the months passed, I realized that Michelle had actually done me the greatest favor of my life by asking for that divorce. She had forced me to stop hiding who I really was, to stop accepting relationships based on pretense and performance, to stop settling for a life that felt empty despite being financially successful. The final piece of closure came on a Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly 1 year after our anniversary party. Sarah handed me an envelope that had arrived by regular mail, my name written in Michelle's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single page, handwritten on cheap notebook paper. "Charles, I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. Not just the money, though I think about that every day when I'm working. My third job and wondering how I'll pay rent. I threw away a man who loved me unconditionally and would have given me anything if I had simply been grateful for what I already had. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a second chance. I just wanted you to know that I realize I made the biggest mistake of my life. I hope you find the happiness I was too selfish to appreciate. Michelle." I read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace in my office and dropped it into the flames. Watching it burn, I felt the last weight of our failed marriage lift from my shoulders. That evening, I called Anna and asked if she'd like to come to my mountain cabin for the weekend. Not because I wanted to impress her with my property, but because I wanted to share the sunrise with someone who would appreciate its beauty for its own sake. "I'd love to," she said simply. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," I replied, and for the first time in years I meant exactly what I said. As I hung up the phone and looked around my office, the same office where Michelle had once demanded I give her access to money she had never earned, where Marcus and David had tried to convince me to reward them for betraying me, I realized that my father's advice about discretion had been half right. The key wasn't hiding who you were. It was being selective about who you revealed yourself to. It wasn't about protecting your money from everyone. It was about sharing your life only with people who valued you for reasons that went beyond your bank account. I had learned to recognize the difference between people who wanted something from me and people who simply wanted to know me. It had taken Michelle's spectacular betrayal to teach me that lesson, but it was a lesson worth learning. At 60 years old, I was finally free to be exactly who I was, with exactly the people who deserved to know the real Charles Morrison. And for the first time since my father died, I was genuinely happy with the life I had built. The empire was no longer silent. More importantly, it was no longer lonely.